Actually, what I'm here to talk about, as you can see, is to talk about MPN Voice, which is a, well, now that you know that I'm a school teacher, I'm going to use this analogy, okay? We're kind of like a teenager. MPN Voice is kind of like a teenager. We've got beyond childhood. We've kind of figured out a few things, but we're by no means mature adults. We don't know the answer to everything by any means, and in actual fact, sitting behind the same desk as some of these people, I feel extremely fraudulent really talking about MPN Voice as an established organization. However, there are a few things that when I tell you about our story, you may find helpful, particularly those of you who are in the processes of building your own organizations and wondering where it might lead you. In actual fact, I think probably the most important things I've got to say will be about the potential challenges and threats that we find ourselves in as we approach maturity, shall we say. Okay, so MPN Voice started, Claire Harrison's around here somewhere, and she will remember pretty much exactly when it started, but I think roughly 2002. So we're talking about getting on for 15 years ago now. A few of us, and in fact, I don't think I was even in the first meeting, but a few of us sat around, grouped around a particular clinical center. So this was, at the time, it was St. Thomas's Hospital. It's subsequently become Guy's and St. Thomas's. Grouped around a particular doctor, okay, in this case, Claire Harrison, to think about how can we help other patients, okay? Initially, the aims were to provide up-to-date information. And as we know, as sufferers of rare disorders, one of the primary challenges, especially 15, 20 years ago, was simply getting access to up-to-date and reliable information. Unfortunately, that is a situation that still persists. For the vast majority of MPN and CLL patients globally, information is the thing which is at its absolute rarest. Obtaining reliable and up-to-date information about the illnesses, about treatment options, etc., is still extremely hard to come by. So this remains an extremely valid mission of any patient support organization. And secondly, the idea of providing patient-to-patient contact in whatever form, okay? So 20 years ago, pre-social media, so patient-to-patient contact meant organizing face-to-face meetings where patients could come into contact with each other, share stories with each other, look each other in the eye, empathize, sympathize. Incredibly powerful and valuable activities. And the number one piece of feedback we get from all of our patients is exactly that. The thing that I get most from the meetings, the thing that I get most from the website is the idea that I'm not alone, that I can share my worries, share the burden of my illness with other people in the same situation. So an incredibly important part of the activity. So at first we simply met, and this group of patients grew from 5 to 6, and it grew to 10 to 20 to 30 to 40. And we simply met at a room that Claire organized for us in the hospital. Alongside that, so it wasn't so long ago that we were pre-website, but we created the first iteration of our website. And again, it was simply about providing a platform to deliver reliable, up-to-date, and sort of professionally vetted information, okay? Alongside that, and we ought to all be aware that now we are in the era of social media, we ought to be aware that, especially given the demographic of our patient community, not everybody's on Twitter all the time. Not everybody looks at websites all the time. Some people don't even read email. Okay, so we're still in the era of printed material being extremely important. And I think we've seen, I mean, on the tables outside the room and outside in the hall, we can see that printed material is still an extremely valid thing to do. Initially, we spent nearly all of our money on printers. And I think it's still an extremely valid thing to do. Having leaflets in doctors in clinics and things like that is still a very important activity. So alongside this, our meetings became larger. We found that patients would bring carers with them, or carers would come by themselves. And so it became a much broader community than simply patients on their own. And alongside this, of course, we started to need to generate some funds. Now, this was where we were seriously in our infancy, and I'll make some reference to some of the kind of legal models, legal and financial models that we've found have worked for us. But as I say, initially we were raising money simply to pay for stuff to be printed. Okay, so as we grew, we established ourselves more formally. And this is a very important point. I don't think, from my memory, we ever seriously considered at that point becoming a independent registered charity in the UK. And I think that primarily that was because easily accessible to us at that time was an umbrella charity, an umbrella legal entity that already existed in the location where we were based, that we could become part of. And there's a parallel to that in the MPN Advocates network that I've subsequently become involved in, is that the idea of becoming a child of an existing legal entity can enable you to bypass so many major hurdles, if you like, because a lot of the legal questions about establishing yourself as a charitable organization, about proving that you're properly accounted, all of those types of things are problems that have been solved already, and you can leverage the answers to those problems without having to take on all of those challenges yourself. I think one point I'd like to make at this stage is that the idea of becoming a subgroup of an established organization sometimes does not sit well with the type of people that we tend to be. A lot of us have become patient advocates and have got involved in patient support because we want to do something ourselves. We want to do something as individuals to make a difference, to help. And sometimes that approach to helping other people, it's not always the most obvious thing to do, is to then become part of a larger organization. And I'd just like to say that I kind of felt a little bit like that when I got involved in this, and I think that was a mistake. I think we should have looked, especially when we're talking about the MPN Advocates Foundation as opposed to MPN Voice. I think we should have looked harder in the first instance about becoming part of something that already existed. And I would encourage any of you out there who are kind of at that stage to seriously consider that option. It may seem more attractive to be independent at this stage, but I think in our experience, in the long run, it's turned out to be better to be part of a bigger group. So as I say, we became part of the larger charity at Guy's and St Thomas's. This enabled us to generate more funds, and we built our second generation website on that basis. The thing that we started to add to our website were the more interactive capabilities, putting people in touch with each other. And alongside that, and in the same vein, we established what we call our buddy network. So our buddy network now exists as essentially a registry of patients who are able and willing to talk to other patients. And primarily that simply involves them putting up their hand and saying, yeah, I'm happy to do that. But probably the number two thing that our patients tell us is that that's the most valuable thing, especially in early diagnosis. When somebody has just walked out of a hematologist's office, having been told that they have a life-altering, incurable blood cancer, they kind of want to talk to people. They especially want to talk to people who are in the same boat. And our buddy system gets incredibly good responses. And of course, as it grows, as you've been buddied, you appreciate the value of it, and you want to become a buddy yourself. So it becomes a snowball effect, and it's an amazing aspect of the work that we've done. And it's a very, very simple thing to do. All you need is an email address or a phone number, and to make yourself available. I've been a buddy on a few occasions, and I think I'm lucky in my case that it seemed to make a difference fairly quickly. Some people stay buddies for years and years, and it's a very flexible and powerful model. So just to continue the story, we've started. Well, in fact, we've definitely expanded geographically. We now run face-to-face patient meetings in many cities all around the UK. Primarily based on centres of expertise in the clinician community. So I think the kind of the seed for a lot of these physical meetings is often a clinician, an expert clinician in a centre who has both the aptitude and the opportunity to create some sort of physical event, if you like, a meeting. So they have the space, that kind of thing, meeting rooms, et cetera, in hospitals. These are relatively simple things to organise. And our meetings typically have become clusters around these medical centres. And of course, the clinicians in those centres know who the patients are and know who the people who might benefit from it. So I think that's a model that has typically worked very well. And of course, as we've grown, our fundraising events have become much more large, much more systematically organised, and much more successful. Our budget now, I mean, in the context of leukemia care, for instance, this is peanuts, but in the context of our early meetings, it's huge. Our budget is approximately £200,000. So that's a pretty rapid growth over that period, and it's enabled us to start doing some amazing things. As I said, the initial focus, and I think this would be my kind of take on this initially, would be the initial focus is what patients need right now. Information, patient-to-patient contact. What they will need is a cure. What they will need is more research. Okay? And to that end, we have, during this sort of second phase of our evolution, started to fund research ourselves. Now, we were never established on that basis, but it's something that we've been enabled to do by the success of our fundraising, and specifically the funding the research that we started to fund was an epidemiology study. So why do people get MPNs in the first place? What is it that has happened to them at some point? We know these are acquired diseases; they're not inherited diseases. We know they're acquired. How did they acquire them? And so the funding that the research that we're funding in the UK is one of the first major studies into epidemiology of these diseases. And that's one of the things that we've been able to do, but specifically we did that because our patients wanted it. We did a very kind of crude survey of what are the things that you would like us to spend money on, and to my mind, actually slightly surprisingly, they were more concerned about finding out how they'd ended up in this situation than actually what they could do about it, because they kind of work on a day-to-day basis about dealing with it, but they kind of wanted to know what the hell happened, how did I get here in the first place? And I think it's a very good point, and it's unsurprising that the pharma industry is more concerned with finding therapies for the conditions. Possibly an unanswered question at this point is, how did it happen in the first place? Okay, so just to bring the story up to date, we now run, as well as the face-to-face meetings around the UK, we now run a biannual event in London, which is a full-day patient conference. It's kind of piggybacks on the back of a medical conference that Claire Harrison organises every couple of years. The nice thing about that is that it brings world-class physicians to London, and so we get them to stay overnight on the Friday night. I guess Claire takes them out for a nice meal or something like that as part of the package. And then on the Saturday, they come and talk to patients. What I hear from the doctors is that they actually get a huge amount from that experience themselves. Being in the same room as a group of committed patient support people is an enabling and an empowering experience for those guys. So this is a model that I think works very well. On the advocacy side, again, it was never something that we specifically set out to do when we started MPN Voice, which is slightly ironic given that advocacy means voice. But most recently, activity has been centered around engaging in the health technology assessment process, essentially the decisions about whether or not a particular drug can be funded for the patient community. And I'm glad to say that we've been successful in supporting those assessments. I'd say supporting. It's the way the HTA process works in the UK is definitely that patients are consulted rather than being actively involved in the process. But that consultation process so far has been successful. And one of the aims, I think, of this type of organization must be to do that on a more systematic, a more reliable, and on a more effective basis. I think we were helped in the specific instance I'm referring to by a couple of patients who gave really game-changing presentations in these assessment forums. And it was really largely on the basis of the power of their individual voices that the decision was favorable, and it was only favorable in the second time of asking, by the way. But we need to do better than that. We won't always be able to produce that patient who has the powerful, effective voice, who's able to go to a meeting on a particular day to make a particular argument, to produce their own powerful personal evidence. We won't be able to do that. What we must do is create a system, a machine, that will enable us to do that on a repeatable, day-to-day basis. Because as we know, these discussions are going to get more and more frequent, hopefully as the pharma companies come up with more and more potential drugs. So the discussions are going to get more and more frequent, but they're going to get more and more heated because we're competing with other drugs. And the amount of money, guess what? It's not growing that fast. So those arguments, those health technology assessments are going to be very, very important forums for patient advocacy organizations to exist in. And we need to get better at it, and we need to share our experience of what works and what doesn't work. And that's one of my big things this weekend, is to try and establish the basis on which we can have that information sharing, that expertise sharing, if you like, across patient groups. So our focus as MPN Voice remains on patient support, giving reliable, up-to-date information. And the information changes, right? New therapies emerge, new indications emerge, new approaches emerge, and we need to keep up to date on top of that, because guess what? Even if you're a patient that lives 90 minutes from Guy's and St. Thomas's, which is a global center of expertise for MPNs, even if you live 90 minutes away from that hospital, the information you get from your hematologist could be shockingly bad. So God help the person who lives in the Siberian tundra, or, I don't know, 20 minutes from Belgrade, or wherever it is. And so the dissemination and the access to reliable, up-to-date information is still crucially important in these areas. I've mentioned my pride in the amount of money that we currently raise and are able to spend. Okay, so how am I doing for time? Okay. Yeah. This is the important bit. Okay. I think the things that have enabled us to get to where we are, and by the way, I hope you're not getting the message that I think everything's fine. and I'll tell you in a minute about what else we need to be doing, but the things that have enabled us to get to where we are. Firstly, committed individuals. The people that work on our steering committee are amongst the most dedicated, selfless individuals you could imagine. And I know you can all relate to that. But they choose to give up their time. We're virtually completely operated by volunteers. We only have one part-time member of staff, as it were. She herself does that work for very, very little money because she's a patient herself, because she's dedicated to what we're doing, okay? So the commitment of individuals, if you can sit around a table and you can look people in the eye and say, do we share the same vision? Are we ready to put in the hours, to put in the effort to do this? That's the number one thing, okay? Secondly, make sure your aims are simple and achievable. When we set out with MPN Voice, very, very simple. Information, reliable, up-to-date information. That's what patients need most. That was a simple thing. We need to keep doing it, but it was a simple thing to do. Over time, our ambitions have grown, but they've grown gradually. And we've never taken on more than we think we could achieve at any one time. Thirdly, and I've mentioned this already, in my view, if there is an umbrella organization that you can become part of, I think it rapidly accelerates the process of becoming more mature, okay? Becoming a legal entity that is able to receive and account for funding is an important step for any organization like this. And this is something, a lesson that I wish I'd learned a little bit more quickly than I did. And growth, in my view, happens best when it's organic and it's gradual. Okay, I think it would be very easy to find some visionary people to sit around a table and think, wouldn't it be great in 5 or 10 years' time we can be doing blah, blah, blah. Okay, yes, it would be great, but you're going to get there by small steps. And I think that's the way to achieve success. You will build on the things that you do on a day-to-day, on a month-by-month, on a year-by-year basis. And having a vision is a great thing, but you need to get there in steps, in my view. Okay, so the challenges. I think we currently suffer from what in the industry I used to work in, we used to call a key man problem. Highly sexist way of putting it, but the problem is that we are still reliant upon a very small group of committed individuals. There are a few specific people without whom our organization, I think, would struggle, would seriously struggle. Okay, and I think that's a if you like, a threat or a risk that we currently suffer from. And the only real solution to it is growth, bringing in more committed and talented people into your group, into your sphere, is an important aspect of that. And you need to be flexible to do that, because those talented and committed people will not always 100% share your vision. Okay, and you need to find a way of leveraging their talents and their opportunity and their energy. And that's not always easy. The division of responsibilities that we currently have in our steering group, in MPN Voice, is pretty informal. And that's something that I won't say keeps me awake at night. There's other things that do that. But the thing that does worry me sometimes is that sometimes things can drop between the gaps. So specific responsibilities that we probably have as an organization don't always get picked up. Sometimes we overlap each other slightly, and that can cause tensions. So the informality, although I think to some respects is a useful thing, because we don't get bogged down in kind of office politics, if you like. But on the other hand, I think there could be scenarios, we thankfully haven't had too many of them so far, but there could be scenarios whereby we step on each other's toes, or we drop the ball in some instances, or something like that. And those things can be existential to organizations like this. Let's not labor that point. One thing I would say about one specific aspect of becoming part of the larger charitable organisation that I mentioned, the charity based at Guy's, is that we've actually found it a little bit difficult to find out where our money came from, because it's an umbrella legal entity that donations come into as a larger entity. Sometimes it's not 100% easy to find out who your donors actually were, and being able to engage and contact them directly. Hopefully that's not a generic issue that these type of arrangements have, but it may be one just to watch out for. And I've mentioned that point about being kind of reliant on specific individuals. So there's let's not call it a kind of do or don't do list, but just a few personal reflections on how MPN Voice has got to where it is. I think there's quite a lot on that list that I would, are in my mind, and I know in Claire Harrison's mind, about how the organisation will continue to evolve. As I say, I feel, more than a little fraudulent, to be honest, standing here with an organisation of a relatively modest size, of a relatively short history, talking on the subject of an established organisation. But I'm hopeful that some of the experiences that we've had will be useful to those of you who are somewhere along that journey yourselves. So, any questions?
Peter Dorfman from Canada. In deciding to join the larger organization, did you go in thinking how much money you wanted? Did you have a written agreement with them? Did you ask for a position of being on their board of directors? How did that play out?
I think in this specific instance, we were very lucky that the larger organization was deliberately set up to accept organizations like ours. So they kind of knew all that already. We didn't want any money at all from them. All we wanted was a mechanism, a platform, and most usefully a legal entity that was registered as a charity in the UK that we could receive funding into. I mean, I think before that, now Claire, I don't know where you are, but correct me if I'm wrong. I think the funding at that point came directly into some individual bank account that was obviously very, very difficult to account for. And so the most important thing there was simply the fact that they had an accounted legal entity that we could leverage. So I know that's not really an answer to your question.
I wanted to ask you, Jon, about your research. When you said you're going to do the research about the reasons of why people get to the situation. With all the challenges that you mentioned, the lack of manpower, how do you plan and how do you implement such a research, which is not an easy? And my second question is the funding, how much research like that will cost? And the third one, when you plan such a research, do you also plan for the future of a publication coming out of this research?
Giora, you're only allowed one question, that's three. First answer is we're not. And the question was, how are you going to actually operate this research? The answer is we're not operating the research, we're simply funding an initiative being run by a clinician in a separate hospital in the UK. So we're providing the funding for an initiative that was proposed to us. So the actual operation of the research is being done in that clinical centre by that doctor. The second question was, how much is it going to was that the second question? How much is it going to cost? So the initial, the research is structured as I think we're calling it a pilot study. So the pilot study is costing somewhere in the region of £500,000, and we're funding a proportion of that. From memory, about half of that. And on the basis of the patient group funding part of it, the government, or I think at least other funding sources, have been happy to fund the rest. The rest of the funding for the major study that we hope will come from that will need to come from more traditional sources of research funding. We definitely want to stay involved, and not just on an advisory basis, on a financial basis, but we're not intending to fund the entire study. Now, what was the third one? Oh, are we going to publish the results? Of course.
Yeah, second row.
Hello, I'm Tune from the Norwegian Blood Cancer Association. I'm curious about one of the topics that you were working about. You said that you were working with peer support, with Buddy,
Yeah.
and you said that the only thing they needed to do was to put up their hand to say that they were willing to do it. So does that mean that you don't have any training, no interview, no courses of the people who are supposed to be buddies, and how does that work?
Brilliant question. The short answer is that we provide support to buddies. So we explain to buddies what it entails, and we do this before asking for them to volunteer. We explain exactly what the job entails. We also set very clear limits on what we expect buddies to actually tell patients. We're very clear that buddies are not there to provide medical information. So in a situation where a patient started sending their buddy, say, a printout of their last blood counts, I think that would be crossing the line between patient support and proper clinical advice. So we're very clear about the boundaries of what the job entails. Secondly, and I think there's a very important point that you're probably alluding to, is the potential burden that being a buddy could place on an individual. Very often, not very often, but sometimes the stories, the situation you find yourself engaged in as a buddy may not have a good outcome, and that can be a difficult situation for a buddy to find themselves in. And it's happened a few times, and I think in that situation, what we as the group have to provide is support for the buddy, support and advice for the buddy, and to make ourselves available to that person if they find themselves in a situation where they're finding it difficult to give the right advice, or that they don't quite know what to say, or they're just finding the burden of that situation is weighing themselves down, and that can happen. So I think in terms of training, I think that's an excellent point, and possibly I should have that on the right-hand side of my slide. I think the degree of professionalism that the role potentially requires is something that we haven't really thought about too much yet. But I think so far we've found ourselves in a situation where the relatively informal arrangement that we've got seems to work. I know it's not a complete answer to your question, but it's a great question.
John, I've got a question for you.
Go ahead, Zach.
Firstly, I think you're being very modest. If you're only a teenager, I look forward to seeing what you've got planned for the future.
Yeah, but you're the old man.
Very young to be called an old man.
Okay. For your info, Zach's here as a representative of Leukemia Care, which is one of the UK's most established and best-run charities.
Oh, thank you. So my question for you is, MPN Voice has done something very remarkable in setting up quite a good stream of income that's not reliant on pharmaceutical funding. Have you got any advice you can give to advocates setting up their own organisations on how to do that?
Not really, because I'd be even more fraudulent standing up here saying that I'd really had all that much to do with fundraising activity. We haven't, but what it comes back to is the first point on the left-hand side of the slide. One of the things that we found with the people who wanted to volunteer for MPN Voice was that they really, really wanted to get involved in helping on a financial basis. Not necessarily through their own donations, but through organising activities that would generate funding. And so our funding model, and Zach's right to point out that we're not, except in one or two very, very specific instances, reliant on pharma funding. our model is extremely decentralized. It's extremely small scale. So the largest donations of that £200,000, I think, are roughly of the order of £10,000 to £15,000. So we're not reliant on a few large donations. What we are reliant upon is hundreds of small events, small activities that go on. People raising funds through their kids doing things at school, through organizing auctions at dinner parties, very small things that might raise £1,000 or £2, adds up to an incredibly powerful and, most importantly, a very resilient source of funding. If you're reliant on 2 or 3 large donors, you always run the risk of something happening in that situation where 1 or 2 of them can go away. It's virtually impossible that our highly decentralized, federated source of funding could be affected by an individual event. So, and again, not a complete answer to the question, but hopefully helpful.
And we're running quite late, so just a final question from Charlotte, and then we'll move on to the next speaker.
No, the lady wanted to talk before. Yeah, it's okay. May I? Sorry. Okay. She.
Charlotte.
Sorry for the misunderstanding. Charlotte Roffian from the Lymphoma Coalition. I have a question about your relationship with doctors. Do doctors...
I'm sorry, relationship with?
Doctors, healthcare professionals.
Yeah.
Do they refer patients to your organization? How do you work together?
Great question again, thank you. How do we work with doctors? So I'm pretty sure Claire will tell you that, or would tell you that, establishing a network amongst clinicians is as important as establishing a network amongst patient support people, okay? So one of the first enabling factors there is to make sure that doctors all know about the activity that you're doing, okay? So simple awareness and information sharing and sharing of enthusiasm for the project, if you like. And I think Claire's done an amazing job in that respect to make that happen in the UK. Secondly, simply providing practical stuff like the printed material for them to put in their waiting rooms. Okay, again, a relatively simple thing to do. One of the things we got our volunteers, in fact, all of our patients to do at an early stage was, next time you go to your doctor, please take 20 copies of our leaflet, ask them where you can put it in the waiting room, put it on prominent display, and next time you go, make sure it's still there or top it up. So that kind of thing. But I think probably the biggest thing is the first point I mentioned, coming back to making sure that the doctors themselves are aware of what you're doing and publicizing it as much with them as you do with the patient community.